A millionaire CEO sees a little girl leave a letter on the grave of his deceased beloved. He turns pale at what was written. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story, The Autumn. Air in Westbrook Cemetery carried a crisp chill, rustling the golden leaves scattered along the stone pathways. Jackson Blackwell stepped out of his sleek black Bentley, adjusting the cuffs of his custom-made suit. He was a man of wealth and power, the CEO of Blackwell Industries. Yet as he walked through the cemetery past rows of old tombstones, he felt none of the authority that defined him in the corporate world. Today marked the 3rd anniversary of his wife Whitney's passing, and every year he made this lonely pilgrimage to honor the woman he had loved more than anything. No board meetings, no acquisitions, no deadlines, just silence and the overwhelming grief that never seemed to fade. As he approached her grave, his polished shoes crunching against the gravel, he noticed something unusual. A small girl sat beside Whitney's headstone, her tiny arms wrapped around her knees. She couldn't have been more than 7 or 8, dressed in a thin, faded jacket despite the biting cold. Her brown hair was tousled, and her face, pale and innocent, bore an expression of deep sorrow. Jackson's brows furrowed. It was rare to see strangers near his wife's grave. Who was this child, and why did she look as if she belonged there? Clearing his throat, Jackson spoke, his voice carrying the weight of curiosity and authority. "Hey, are you lost?" The girl looked up, her large, tear-filled eyes locking onto Jackson's with an intensity that made him pause. There was something oddly familiar about those eyes, something that sent a strange uneasiness crawling up his spine. The girl shook her head slowly. "No," she whispered. "I came to see my mom." For a moment, Jackson thought he had misheard. His heart pounded against his ribs and a cold, creeping sensation settled in his chest. "Your what?" he asked, his voice unsteady. The girl hesitated before pointing to the name engraved on the marble headstone. Whitney Blackwell. The world seemed to tilt. Jackson felt his breath hitch, his mind racing in a desperate attempt to make sense of what he had just heard. His wife had never been pregnant, at least not to his knowledge. They had talked about having children, but life had gotten in the way. The long work hours, the stress, the silent sacrifices they had both made. And then, before they could ever make it happen, she was gone. Yet here stood a child claiming to be her daughter. As the girl placed a small folded letter near the flowers Jackson had brought, he noticed her hand trembling. "I'm Sophia," she said quietly. "She used to visit me before she went to heaven." Jackson's hands clenched into fists, his pulse roaring in his ears as he reached for the letter she had left behind. The first sentence alone made his world collapse. "Dear Mommy, I miss you so much." Jackson stood frozen in place, his breath forming small misty clouds in the cold air. The little girl beside his wife's grave, this child named Sophia, had just shattered everything he thought he knew about Whitney. His mind refused to accept the possibility, but the emotions in his chest told a different story. He had built his life on logic, strategy, and careful decision-making. Yet here he was, staring into the tear-filled eyes of a child who bore an uncanny resemblance to the woman he had loved. Every fiber of his being wanted to deny it, to walk away and convince himself that this was some mistake. But he couldn't. Something in Sophia's face, in the way she clung to the gravestone as if it were her last connection to a mother she barely knew, anchored Jackson to the moment. He swallowed hard and forced himself to speak. "Who else knows about this?" he asked, his voice quieter now, measured. Sophia looked down, kicking at the fallen leaves near the headstone. "Just Miss Clara," she murmured. "She told me when I was old enough to understand. She said my mommy loved me but couldn't take care of me. She used to come sometimes, but then she stopped." The girl hesitated before looking up again. "Did she stop because of you?" The question hit Jackson like a punch to the gut. He staggered back slightly, caught off guard by the raw innocence in Sophia's voice. His heart pounded as the implications settled in. Had Whitney kept this child a secret from him out of guilt? Had she feared his reaction? He had never been cruel, but he knew himself. He was a man who valued control, who expected honesty, who never dealt well with unexpected chaos. Had she been afraid that telling him would destroy them? He crouched down, leveling his gaze with Sophia's. "I didn't know about you," he said, his voice laced with a mix of regret and disbelief. If I had, things would have been different. But even as he said the words, he wondered if they were true. Would he have accepted this? Would he have taken in a child and raised her as his own? Straightening up, he pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number for his private investigator, Marcus Reed. "I need you to look into something for me," he said the moment the line connected. "A girl named Sophia at a children's home. Find out everything, how she got there, who her biological father is, and if there are any records connecting her to Whitney." He ended the call before Marcus could ask questions. Right now, he didn't have the patience for explanations. He turned back to Sophia, who was watching him with cautious curiosity. "Come with me," Jackson said, offering his hand. Sophia hesitated. "Where?" "Somewhere warm. You shouldn't be out here in this cold." Sophia glanced at the headstone one last time before slipping her small hand into Jackson's. It was a simple gesture, yet it sent an unexpected wave of emotion crashing over him. As they walked toward his car, one thought dominated Jackson's mind. Whitney had kept a life-altering secret from him, and now he needed to understand why. Jackson drove through the bustling streets of New York, the weight of the night's revelations pressing heavily on him. The city's bright lights and constant motion felt surreal, as if he had been thrust into someone else's life. He glanced at Sophia, who sat quietly in the passenger seat, small hands gripping the edges of her oversized jacket. The child looked out the window, her face reflecting a mix of exhaustion and uncertainty. "Where do you live?" Jackson asked, keeping his voice casual despite the storm of emotions raging inside him. "At Harmony House," Sophia replied softly. "It's in Brooklyn. Miss Clara takes care of us there." Jackson nodded, adjusting his course. His mind raced with questions about Whitney, how she could have hidden a child from him, why she would have made such a choice. They had shared everything, or so he thought. Their marriage had been built on trust and honesty, yet this secret suggested a side to his wife he had never known. As they pulled up to Harmony House, Jackson was struck by how modest the building appeared. A 3-story brick structure wedged between taller apartments, its facade showing signs of age and wear. This was where Whitney's daughter had been living while he resided in a penthouse overlooking Central Park. The thought made his stomach turn. A tired-looking woman in her 60s greeted them at the door, her eyes widening with recognition when she saw Jackson. "Mr. Blackwell?" she asked, adjusting her glasses before looking down at Sophia. "What's going on? Is Sophia all right?" "Are you Miss Clara?" Jackson asked, his tone businesslike. The woman nodded, ushering them inside. "I've been expecting you to show up eventually," she said cryptically, leading them to a small office lined with filing cabinets and children's artwork. "Please sit." Once they were settled, Clara turned to Sophia. "Sweetheart, would you mind waiting in the common room for a few minutes? I need to speak with Mr. Blackwell alone." Sophia looked between them, hesitation evident in her eyes, but she nodded and quietly left the room. As soon as the door closed, Jackson leaned forward. "I want answers," he said, his voice low and tense. "That child claims to be Whitney's daughter." Clara sighed heavily, removing her glasses and rubbing the bridge of her nose. "Because she is," she confirmed. "Whitney brought Sophia to us when she was just an infant. She said she couldn't care for her properly at the time, but wanted to remain in her life. And you never thought to contact me?" Jackson's voice rose slightly, his control slipping. "I'm her husband." "Was her husband?" "Whitney was very clear about her wishes," Clara replied calmly. "She made me promise never to reach out to you. She said it would complicate things, that you weren't ready to be a father." She paused, studying his face. She visited Sophia regularly until her accident. The poor child was devastated when the visit stopped. Jackson ran a hand through his dark hair, trying to process this information. "Who is the father?" he asked, though he dreaded the answer. Clara shook her head. "Whitney never said. The birth certificate has no father listed." "When was Sophia born?" 8 years ago. January 14th. Jackson did the math quickly. Whitney would have been pregnant before they met. Their relationship had begun 7 years ago, and they married just 6 months later, in a whirlwind romance that had shocked their social circles. "She kept this from me our entire relationship," he said, more to himself than to Clara. The betrayal cut deep, making it hard to breathe. "I need to see any documentation you have, birth certificates, visitation records, anything." Clara hesitated. "Mr. Blackwell, what are your intentions here? Sophia has already lost her mother. She's a vulnerable child who—" "I'm not going to hurt her," Jackson interrupted, his voice softer now. "I just need to understand. Whitney was my wife. I thought I knew her." After a moment, Clara nodded and pulled a file from one of the cabinets. "This is everything we have on Sophia. Whitney set up a small trust for her education, but it's limited. She's been well cared for here, but it's not a home," Jackson finished for her. As he flipped through the documents, his eyes caught on a photograph. Whitney holding an infant Sophia, her face radiant with love. The image made his chest ache. Here was a side of his wife he had never witnessed, a joy he had never been part of. "What happens to her now?" he asked, looking up from the file. Clara's expression turned wary. "That depends on you, Mr. Blackwell. She has no other family that we know of. Whitney was all she had." Jackson closed the file, his decision already forming. "I'd like to take her with me temporarily, while I sort this out." "I'm not sure that's appropriate without proper legal." "I'll have my attorneys handle the paperwork first thing tomorrow," he interrupted. "But I'm not leaving her here tonight, not now that I know." Clara studied him for a long moment before sighing. "I'll need you to sign some temporary guardianship forms at least, and I'll be checking in regularly." Jackson nodded his agreement, relieved that she hadn't put up more resistance. "I want to do right by her," he said quietly, whatever that means. 20 minutes later, after signing several forms and gathering Sophia's meager belongings into a small backpack, they were back in his car. The child sat silently beside him, clutching her backpack as if it contained all the security she had left in the world. "Am I going to stay with you?" she asked finally, her voice small but steady. Jackson glanced at her, trying to see Whitney in her features. The resemblance was there, in the shape of her eyes, the curve of her mouth when she frowned. "Yes," he replied, "for now." "Because you were married to my mom." The question was so direct, so innocent that it caught him off guard. "Yes," he said again, then added more gently, "and because I think that's what she would have wanted." It was the first time he had considered what Whitney might have wanted in this situation. Would she have wanted her daughter to be with him? Or had she kept Sophia separate from their life together for a reason? As they drove toward his penthouse, Jackson's mind turned to Marcus. He needed answers, not just about Sophia's history, but about the biological father. The thought of another man in Whitney's life, someone significant enough to father her child, left a bitter taste in his mouth. They arrived at his building, the doorman's surprised expression at seeing Jackson, with a child quickly masked by professional courtesy. In the elevator, Sophia stood close to him, her eyes wide as she watched the floor numbers climb higher and higher. "You live very far up," she observed. Jackson found himself smiling slightly at her comment. "The 42nd floor," he told her. "You can see the whole city from up there." When the elevator doors opened directly into his penthouse, Sophia gasped. The space was immaculate and modern, all clean lines, glass, and polished surfaces, with floor-to-ceiling windows showcasing the glittering cityscape. It was a home designed for a successful businessman, not for a child. "This is where you live?" she asked, her voice filled with awe. "Yes," Jackson replied, suddenly seeing his home through her eyes. The sleek, uncomfortable-looking furniture, the absence of color or warmth, the distinct lack of anything that might appeal to a child. "It's very clean," Sophia offered diplomatically. Despite everything, Jackson felt an unexpected laugh escape him. "Yes, I suppose it is." He set her backpack down. "Are you hungry?" Sophia nodded hesitantly, while Jackson ordered dinner. Realizing belatedly that he had no idea what children typically ate, Sophia wandered around the living room, her small hands carefully avoiding touching anything. She stopped in front of a photograph on the mantel, one of the few personal touches in the entire penthouse. "That's her," she said quietly. "That's my mom." Jackson moved to stand beside her, looking at the wedding photo he had kept despite the pain it sometimes caused. Whitney was radiant in white, her smile bright and carefree as she looked up at him. "Yes," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "That's Whitney." Sophia reached out, her fingers hovering just above the glass frame. "She used to sing to me sometimes," she whispered. "When she visited, she had a nice voice." The simple observation hit Jackson with unexpected force. Whitney had indeed had a beautiful voice, something she rarely shared with others. How many other private moments had she shared with this child that he knew nothing about? What else did she do when she visited? He found himself asking. Sophia's face brightened slightly at the question. "She brought me books, and we would read together. Sometimes she would tell me stories about places she'd been." Her voice dropped lower. "She said one day she would take me to see the ocean." Jackson swallowed hard. Whitney had loved the ocean. It was where they had honeymooned, where they had spent their happiest days together. "I've never seen it," Sophia continued. "Is it as big as they say?" "Bigger," Jackson replied. "It goes on forever." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of dinner. As they ate, Jackson observed Sophia carefully, noting how she ate, slowly and with surprisingly good manners. How she kept glancing around the penthouse as if afraid to settle in too comfortably. "You'll stay in the guest room tonight," he told her when they had finished. "Tomorrow we'll figure out something more suitable." Sophia nodded, following him to the spare bedroom with its queen-sized bed and minimalist decor. The bed was enormous, compared to her small frame, and Jackson realized he had no idea how to make a child comfortable for the night. "Do you need anything?" he asked awkwardly. Sophia shook her head, then hesitated. "Do you have a light? For the dark?" Jackson frowned, then understood. "A nightlight?" She nodded, a hint of embarrassment crossing her face. "I don't, but..." He reached for the bedside lamp, adjusting its dimmer to the lowest setting. "We can leave this on. Is that okay?" Sophia nodded again, relief evident in her expression. "Thank you," she said quietly. As Jackson turned to leave, her voice stopped him at the doorway. "Mr. Blackwell?" He turned back. "Yes?" "Are you going to send me back tomorrow?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with uncertainty and fear. Jackson saw in her eyes the same question. Would he, like her mother, eventually disappear? From her life too? "No," he said firmly, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. "I'm not sending you back." Only when he was alone in his study, a glass of whiskey in hand, did Jackson allow himself to fully process the night's events. He pulled out his phone and dialed Marcus again. "I need everything you can find on Sophia," he said without preamble. "And I need to know who her father is. Look into Whitney's past. Anyone she was involved with before me. This is priority one, Marcus." After ending the call, Jackson sat in silence, staring at the city lights below. His orderly life had been upended in the span of a few hours by a child with Whitney's eyes and a secret that had died with his wife. Tomorrow would bring more questions, more decisions. But tonight, in a spare bedroom down the hall, Whitney's daughter slept under his roof, and somehow, despite the pain and confusion, that felt right. The morning sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across Jackson's penthouse. He had barely slept, his mind racing with questions about Whitney and the child now sleeping in his guest room. After years of meticulous control over every aspect of his life, he found himself in uncharted territory. His phone buzzed with a message from Marcus. Preliminary. Info gathered. Can meet at 9 a.m. Jackson glanced at the clock, 7:30. He quietly made his way to the kitchen, starting the coffee machine before pausing, realizing he had no idea what to offer Sophia for breakfast. His refrigerator, typically stocked with premium ingredients for his personal chef to prepare his meals, suddenly seemed woefully inadequate for a child. A small sound caught his attention. Sophia stood in the hallway, her hair slightly mussed. From sleep wearing the same clothes from yesterday. Good morning, Jackson said, feeling oddly formal. Good morning, she replied quietly, her eyes taking in the kitchen with its gleaming surfaces and professional-grade appliances. Are you hungry? He asked, and when she nodded, he continued. What do you usually have for breakfast? Sophia shrugged. Cereal mostly, sometimes toast. Jackson frowned. He had neither. How about eggs? He suggested, remembering one of the few dishes he could competently prepare. Okay, she agreed, climbing carefully onto one of the high stools at the kitchen island. As Jackson cracked eggs into a bowl, he found himself in the unusual position of making small talk with an 8-year-old. Did you sleep all right? Yes, Sophia said, then added, Your house is very quiet. At Harmony House, there's always noise. Jackson considered this as he whisked the eggs. Too quiet? She shook her head. Just different. They ate in relative silence, Jackson stealing glances at the child across from him. In the morning light, her resemblance to Whitney was even more pronounced. The same thoughtful expression, the same way of tilting her head slightly when considering something. I have a meeting this morning, he finally said, but I'd like you to come with me. Sophia looked up, a flicker of anxiety crossing her face. What kind of meeting? With someone who's helping me understand more about your situation, Jackson explained, choosing his words carefully. After that, we'll need to get you some new clothes and other things you might need. She nodded slowly, accepting his plan with the same quiet resignation he had noticed the night before. The demeanor of a child accustomed to having little say in what happened to her. An hour later, they arrived at Jackson's office in the Blackwell Industries headquarters. His assistant Rebecca's eyes widened at the sight of Sophia, but to her credit she recovered quickly. Mr. Blackwell, Mr. Reed is waiting in your private conference room, she said professionally, then smiled at Sophia. And who might this be? Before Jackson could answer, Sophia spoke up. I'm Sophia, she said simply. Rebecca looked questioningly at Jackson, who merely nodded. Rebecca, could you stay with Sophia for a few minutes while I speak with Marcus? Understanding dawned in Rebecca's eyes. She had worked for Jackson long enough to know that Marcus Reed handled his most sensitive investigations. Of course. She agreed, then turned to Sophia with a warm smile. Would you like to see something cool? I have a view of the entire city from my desk. Sophia glanced at Jackson, who gave her an encouraging nod before following Rebecca. Marcus Reed was already seated in the conference room, a folder on the table in front of him. He stood as Jackson entered, his expression carefully neutral. I've found some interesting information, Marcus said after they were seated. But I have to say, this isn't what I expected when you called last night. Neither did I, Jackson admitted. What have you got? Marcus opened the folder, sliding several documents across the table. Sophia Grace Morgan, born January 14, 2017, at New York Presbyterian. Mother listed as Whitney Morgan, her maiden name. No father listed on the birth certificate. Jackson studied the document, the sight of Whitney's signature making his chest tighten. 2 weeks after birth, Whitney placed her in the care of Harmony House Children's Center, with an arrangement for regular visitation rights. Marcus continued. She set up a modest trust fund for the girl's education and basic needs. From what I can gather, she visited consistently, usually twice a month until her death 3 years ago. And there's no indication of who the father might be? Jackson asked, his voice tense. Marcus hesitated. I'm still digging, but there's something interesting. He pulled out another document. Whitney filed a paternity testing request when Sophia was about 6 months old. It appears she never followed through with it, but she listed a potential father, Ethan Reynolds. Jackson froze at the name. Ethan Reynolds was no stranger to him, a ruthless businessman whose tech company often competed with Blackwell Industries for the same contracts. The men had crossed paths at industry events and negotiations tables, maintaining a cold professional courtesy that masked their mutual dislike. "Reynolds?" Jackson repeated, his mind racing. "Are you certain?" Marcus nodded. "The paperwork is clear. Whether she actually informed him or conducted the test, I can't say yet." Jackson leaned back in his chair, processing this information. Whitney had been pregnant with another man's child when they met. Specifically, the child of someone who later became his business rival. Had she known who Reynolds was to Jackson? Had she kept Sophia a secret to avoid complicating their relationship with this connection? "What's your next move?" Marcus asked after a moment. Jackson exhaled slowly. "I need to know if Reynolds knows. About her. If he's aware he has a daughter and has chosen to stay away, or if he's as in the dark as I was. And if he doesn't know, then I need to decide whether to tell him," Jackson said, his jaw tightening. "But first, I need to be absolutely certain he's the father. Can you arrange for DNA testing, discreetly?" Marcus nodded. "I can have it done today if you bring the girl in. Results would take a few days." "Do it," Jackson instructed. "And keep digging into Reynolds. I want to know everything, his personal life, his temperament, any hints that he might have known. About Sophia." As Marcus gathered his documents, he paused. "What are you planning to do with the girl in the meantime?" It was a question Jackson had been asking himself all night. "She stays with me," he said firmly. "At least until I figure this out." Marcus raised an eyebrow but said nothing. They had worked together long enough for him to know when Jackson had made up his mind. When Jackson emerged from the conference room, he found Sophia sitting at Rebecca's desk, carefully drawing on a notepad. She looked up as he approached, her expression guarded, as if preparing herself for bad news. "Everything okay?" Rebecca asked quietly. Jackson nodded. "Rebecca, I need you to clear my schedule for the rest of the day. And could you make some calls? Sophia needs some new clothes, books, and whatever else an 8-year-old might need." Rebecca's eyes widened slightly, but she recovered quickly. "Of course, I can arrange for some items to be delivered to your penthouse, and I know a children's boutique on Fifth Avenue that could accommodate a private shopping appointment this afternoon." "Perfect," Jackson said, then turned to Sophia. "Ready to go?" She nodded, sliding off the chair and carefully placing the pen back exactly where she had found it, a small gesture that spoke volumes about her careful navigation of adult spaces. They rode the elevator down to the lobby. Sophia looked up at him. "Am I in trouble?" she asked quietly. Jackson frowned. "No. Why would you think that?" She shrugged, looking down at her shoes. "People usually have meetings about me when I'm in trouble, or when I'm moving again." The simple statement hit Jackson harder than he expected. This child had spent her life as the subject of adult discussions that determined her fate, always on the outside looking in. "You're not in trouble," he assured her, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "And you're not moving again. Not right now." She studied his face with a seriousness that seemed beyond her years. "Promise?" Jackson hesitated. He wasn't in the habit of making promises he couldn't keep, especially to children. The situation with Reynolds complicated everything. If the man turned out to be Sophia's father and wanted custody, things could get messy quickly. But looking into her eyes, Whitney's eyes, he found himself nodding. "I promise you won't go back to Harmony House," he said carefully. "We'll figure this out together." It wasn't exactly what she had asked for, but it was the most honest answer he could give. Sophia seemed to understand the distinction, giving him a small, hesitant nod in return. The shopping expedition that afternoon was an education for Jackson. Rebecca had arranged everything perfectly, as usual, but nothing in his experience as a CEO had prepared him for the complex logistics of outfitting an 8-year-old girl. Sophia, for her part, seemed overwhelmed by the attention and options, speaking only when directly asked her preferences. "You don't have to get all this," she said quietly as the boutique staff boxed up yet another outfit. "You need clothes." Jackson replied simply, "Not this many," she countered with a logic he couldn't argue with. Jackson knelt down to her level. "Consider it making up for lost time," he said. "Whitney would have wanted you to have nice things." The mention of her mother seemed to soften her resistance. She reached out and touched the sleeve of a soft blue sweater. "She liked blue," Sophia said softly. "She said it matched my eyes." Jackson felt his throat tighten. "She was right," he managed to say. By late afternoon, they had acquired enough clothing, books, and supplies to fill the trunk of his car. As they drove back to the penthouse, Sophia stared out the window, her expression thoughtful. "Mr. Blackwell?" she asked suddenly. "Why are you doing all this?" It was a question Jackson had been asking himself since the moment he found her at Whitney's grave. Why not simply alert the proper authorities and step back? Why bring this child, this complication, into his carefully ordered life? "Because," he said slowly, "Whitney was important to me, and you were important to her." Sophia seemed to consider this. "But you didn't know about me before." "No, I didn't," he admitted. "Are you mad at her for not telling you?" Jackson gripped the steering wheel tighter. Was he angry? Yes, part of him was furious that Whitney had kept such a significant secret, but anger was tangled with grief, confusion, and an unexpected protectiveness toward the child beside him. "I wish she had told me," he said finally. "But I'm not mad at her, I'm just trying to understand." Sophia nodded, as if his answer satisfied something deep within her. She used to say that sometimes people keep secrets because they're scared, not because they're bad. The observation, so simple yet profound, caught Jackson off guard. Had Whitney been scared? Of his reaction, perhaps? Of disrupting their life together? Or of something else entirely? As they pulled into the underground parking of his building, Jackson's phone buzzed with a message from Marcus. DNA sample collected from Reynolds at Charity Gala last week. Testing underway. Also found financial records. Monthly payments from Whitney's personal account to Harmony House, separate from the trust. Started before the girl was born. Jackson put his phone away, his mind racing with the implications. Whitney had planned carefully, preparing for Sophia's care, even before she was born. This wasn't a rash decision or a momentary lapse in judgment. It was deliberate, calculated, just like everything else Whitney had done in her life. As he helped Sophia carry her new belongings into the elevator, Jackson realized that the woman he had married, the woman he thought he knew completely, had been capable of maintaining a life-altering secret for years. And he had never suspected a thing. The question now was what other secrets remained to be discovered, and whether he was prepared for what they might reveal about the woman he had loved, and about Ethan Reynolds, the man who might soon become a complicated part of both their lives. Jackson's penthouse underwent a subtle transformation over the next few days. The spare bedroom, once a minimalist space for occasional guests, now contained colorful bedding, a small bookshelf filled with children's books, and a nightlight shaped like a moon. These changes, though small, signified something larger. Sophia was becoming less of a temporary presence and more of a fixture in his life. While Sophia adjusted to her new environment, Jackson worked tirelessly behind the scenes. Marcus had confirmed that Ethan Reynolds was indeed Sophia's biological father through DNA testing, matching samples from both Reynolds and Sophia with over 99% certainty. The revelation sat like a weight in Jackson's chest. On this particular morning, Jackson sat in his home office reviewing the dossier Marcus had compiled on Reynolds. The man was, by all accounts, as ruthless in his personal life as he was in business. 2 failed marriages, a string of relationships that ended poorly, and a reputation for discarding people once they no longer served his purposes. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Sophia stood in the doorway, a book clutched in her hands. "Am I bothering you?" she asked hesitantly. Jackson shook his head, quickly closing the file on his desk. "Not at all. What do you have there?" She held up the book, a collection of fairy tales. Miss Rebecca brought it yesterday. I finished it already. Jackson smiled, slightly impressed. You must be a fast reader. Sophia shrugged. Mom. She paused, as if uncertain whether she should mention Whitney, then continued. Mom used to bring me books all the time. She said reading was like having adventures without leaving your room. The casual mention of Whitney struck Jackson with unexpected force. How many other little moments, preferences, and habits had Whitney shared with this child that he knew nothing about? She was right, Jackson said, his voice rougher than he intended. He cleared his throat. Would you like more books? We could go to a bookstore today? Sophia's eyes lit up, but she quickly tempered her excitement. Only if you're not too busy. The caution in her response, her automatic assumption that adult schedules and priorities would supersede her desires, made Jackson's chest tighten. How often had she been disappointed by adults in her short life? I'm not too busy, he assured her. Let me make a quick call, and we'll go. After Sophia left to get ready, Jackson called Marcus with specific instructions. Increase surveillance on Reynolds, monitor his movements, and most importantly, ensure he remained unaware of Sophia's existence. Jackson wasn't ready for that confrontation. Not until he had a better plan for protecting Sophia from the fallout. The bookstore visit proved to be an unexpected pleasure. Sophia moved through the children's section with purpose, selecting books with a seriousness that made Jackson smile. They were checking out with a stack of novels, science books, and art supplies, when Jackson spotted a familiar face entering the store, Vanessa Powell, a business associate who ran one of New York's most prestigious private schools. Jackson. Blackwell, she greeted warmly, her eyes moving curiously to Sophia. What a surprise to see you here. Jackson introduced Sophia simply as a family friend's daughter, staying with him temporarily, but Vanessa's shrewd eyes took in the comfortable way Sophia stood near him, the protective hand he placed on her shoulder. She's quite the reader, I see, Vanessa commented, noting their purchases. She is, Jackson agreed, a hint of pride in his voice that surprised even him. After a brief conversation about mutual acquaintances, Vanessa handed him her card. If you're considering educational options for your young friend, give me a call. Brighton Academy has an excellent program for gifted children. The suggestion lingered in Jackson's mind as they drove home. Sophia would need school eventually. A proper education, structure, stability. These were long-term considerations, evidence that in his mind at least her presence in his life was becoming less temporary. Who was that lady? Sophia asked as they rode the elevator up to the penthouse. Someone who runs a school, Jackson replied. A very good one. Sophia nodded thoughtfully. Would I go there? The question was loaded with implications. About permanence, about Jackson's intentions, about the future. Jackson chose his words carefully. Would you like to? Eventually, you'll need to return to school. Sophia was quiet for a moment. I've never been to a real school before. Just classes at Harmony House. She hesitated. Do you think I'd be smart enough? The uncertainty in her voice made Jackson frown. Of course you would, he said firmly. You're very bright. Later that night, after Sophia had gone to bed, Jackson sat in his living room with a glass of scotch, staring at the city lights below. His phone buzzed with a message from Marcus. Reynolds making inquiries about Whitney's past. Source at his office says he's looking into her financial records from 8 to 9 years ago. Jackson's hand tightened around his glass. Why was Reynolds suddenly interested in Whitney's past? Did he suspect something? Or was this just a coincidence? Either way, the clock was ticking. It was only a matter of time before Reynolds discovered the truth, that he had a daughter, and that Jackson Blackwell was currently raising her. The question was no longer if Reynolds would find out, but when. And Jackson needed to be prepared for that moment, because when it came, he would be facing a man known for taking what he wanted by any means necessary. For the first time in years, Jackson felt fear. Not for himself, but for the child sleeping down the hall who had already lost one parent and might soon be caught in a battle between two powerful men who had never intended to be fathers. The following weeks established a rhythm in Jackson's life that he never could have anticipated. Mornings began with breakfast alongside Sophia, followed by his workday, now carefully structured to allow him to return home by early evening. Nights concluded with dinner, and often a story from one of Sophia's new books. The routines were simple, yet profoundly different from his previous solitary existence. After extensive research and a private tour, Jackson had enrolled Sophia in Brighton Academy. Vanessa Powell had been instrumental in expediting the admission process, though she clearly remained curious about Jackson's sudden guardianship of a child. The temporary legal guardianship papers he had filed bought him time, but he knew more permanent arrangements would eventually be necessary. Today marked Sophia's first day at the prestigious school. Jackson stood in the kitchen, preparing coffee, while Sophia ate breakfast dressed in her new uniform, a pleated navy skirt, white blouse and blazer with the Brighton crest. "Nervous?" he asked, noticing how she pushed her cereal around the bowl. She nodded slightly. "What if no one likes me?" Jackson considered this. He was hardly an expert on childhood social dynamics, having attended boarding schools where his family name had guaranteed a certain status. "Just be yourself," he offered. "You're smart and kind. That matters more than anything else." Sophia looked unconvinced, but nodded anyway. As they prepared to leave, Jackson's phone buzzed with a message from Marcus. Reynolds scheduled meeting with Clara at Harmony House today, 3 p.m. Jackson's stomach tightened. Reynolds was getting closer. First Whitney's financial records, now Harmony House. The pieces were coming together for him. "Is everything okay?" Sophia asked, noticing his expression. "Everything's fine," Jackson assured her, pocketing his phone. "Let's get you to school." Brighton Academy occupied a stately brownstone on the Upper East Side, its interior a blend of traditional aesthetics and modern educational facilities. Jackson walked Sophia to her classroom, acutely aware of the curious glances from other parents. Billionaire CEO Jackson Blackwell personally escorting a child to school was bound to raise eyebrows. "I'll pick you up at 3, he told her at the classroom door. Sophia nodded, her face a mask of bravery despite the anxiety evident in her eyes. Promise, the word, so simple, yet weighted with meaning, had become significant between them. It was Sophia's way of seeking reassurance that she wouldn't be forgotten or abandoned again. "Promise," Jackson said firmly. He waited until she entered the classroom before leaving, his mind already shifting to the problem of Ethan Reynolds. If Reynolds was meeting with Clara today, he was close to discovering the truth about Sophia. Jackson needed to get ahead of the situation. Instead of heading to his office, Jackson drove directly to Harmony House. Clara seemed unsurprised to see him. "I had a feeling you'd show up today," she said, leading him to her office. "Your investigator called asking about Ethan Reynolds' appointment." Jackson didn't bother denying it. "What does Reynolds want?" Clara sighed, removing her glasses. "Information about Whitney Morgan's child. He claims to have reason to believe he might be the father, and—" "What will you tell him?" "The truth," Clara said firmly. "That Whitney placed her daughter in our care, that she now lives with Whitney's husband, and that any paternity claims would need to be addressed through legal channels." Jackson nodded, relieved. "Thank you." Clara studied him carefully. "You've grown attached to her." It wasn't a question, but Jackson answered anyway. "Yes." "And if Reynolds is her biological father and wants custody?" Jackson's jaw tightened. "Sophia isn't a possession to be claimed. She's a child who needs stability, not a power struggle between two men she barely knows." Clara smiled slightly. "You sound like a father, Mr. Blackwell." The observation caught Jackson off guard. He hadn't thought of himself in those terms, as Sophia's father rather than just her guardian. The idea was both alarming and strangely fitting. "Will you call me after Reynolds leaves?" he asked, standing to go. "I'd like to know what he says." "Of course," Clara agreed. Jackson spent the rest of the day distracted, his mind constantly returning to the meeting happening at Harmony House. At 2:30 he left to pick up Sophia from school, determined to maintain her routine regardless of what might be unfolding behind the scenes. When he arrived at Brighton, Sophia was waiting with her teacher, Mrs. Bennet, who smiled warmly as they approached. "Sophia had a wonderful first day," she told Jackson. "She's quite articulate for her age." Sophia beamed at the praise, her earlier anxiety replaced with quiet pride. "How was it?" Jackson asked as they walked to the car. "Good," Sophia said, then added more enthusiastically, "We had art class and Mrs. Bennet said my drawing was very detailed." Jackson smiled, genuinely pleased by her excitement. "That's excellent. Maybe we should get you some proper art supplies." As they drove home, Jackson's phone rang. Clara's name flashed on the screen, but he let it go to voicemail, unwilling to have the conversation with Sophia present. That evening, after Sophia had gone to bed, Jackson listened to Clara's message. Reynolds asked many questions about Sophia. Her birth date, physical appearance, schooling. He seemed frustrated by my limited answers. He mentioned retaining a lawyer to explore his paternity rights. "I thought you should know." Jackson poured himself a scotch, his mind racing. Reynolds was moving quickly, more quickly than Jackson had anticipated. The confrontation he'd been dreading was rapidly approaching. His phone rang again. "Marcus, this. Time. Reynolds has hired a private investigator," Marcus reported without preamble. "And he's filed for a court-ordered paternity test. His lawyers will probably contact you tomorrow." Jackson exhaled slowly. "Then we need to be prepared. Contact my legal team tonight. I want options on my desk by morning." After ending the call, Jackson walked to Sophia's room, quietly opening the door to check on her. She slept peacefully, clutching a stuffed rabbit he'd brought home last week. The sight reinforced his resolve. He had promised Sophia stability, promised that she wouldn't be uprooted again. It was a promise he intended to keep, regardless of who her biological father might be. The coming battle with Ethan Reynolds would be unlike any business negotiation or corporate takeover. The stakes were infinitely higher. This wasn't about assets or market shares. It was about a little girl who had already lost too much, and Jackson was prepared to fight with everything he had to protect her. The inevitable confrontation came sooner than Jackson expected. He was reviewing documents in his home office when Rebecca called to inform him that Ethan Reynolds was in the lobby of his building, demanding to see him. Jackson glanced at the clock, 4:30 p.m. Sophia would be home from school any minute with the driver he had arranged. "Tell security to send him up," Jackson instructed, ending the call. He had barely enough time to alert his head of security to intercept Sophia and take her directly to the service elevator before the penthouse intercom announced Reynolds' arrival. Ethan Reynolds strode into the penthouse with the confidence of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. He was impeccably dressed. In a tailored suit, his dark hair precisely styled, every inch the successful tech mogul the business world knew him to be. "Blackwell," he said coolly, not bothering with pleasantries. "I think you know why I'm here." Jackson nodded toward the living room. "Let's talk privately." Once seated, Reynolds wasted no time. "You have my daughter." "I have Whitney's daughter," Jackson corrected, his voice measured. "A child who has been through enough upheaval in her young life." Reynolds' eyes narrowed. "DNA doesn't lie, Blackwell. I've seen the test results. Sophia is my biological child, and I intend to claim my parental rights." "And where were you for the first 8 years of her life?" Jackson asked, unable to keep the edge from his voice. "Whitney never told you about her?" A flicker of something, regret perhaps, or anger crossed Reynolds' face. "No, she didn't. But that doesn't change the facts. I'm Sophia's father and I want to be part of her life." "You mean you want to take her?" Jackson said flatly. Reynolds leaned forward. "She belongs with me. We're blood. What is she to you? The secret child of your dead wife? A charity case?" The accusation stung, but Jackson maintained his composure. "She's a child who needs stability and care, not a trophy to be fought over by two men she barely knows." "My lawyers will be contacting you," Reynolds said, standing abruptly. "I suggest you prepare Sophia for the change. Make it easier on everyone." Jackson rose to face him. "If you truly care about her well-being, you'll consider a less disruptive approach. She's just starting to adjust to school, to life here. With you? A man who isn't her father, who didn't even know she existed until a few weeks ago? Reynolds shook his head. Save the concerned act, Blackwell. We both know this. Is about Whitney, not the girl. Before Jackson could respond, the elevator doors opened and Sophia stepped into the penthouse, her school backpack slung over one shoulder. She froze at the sight of the two men standing in apparent confrontation. "Mr. Blackwell," she said uncertainly. Jackson moved toward her, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. "Sophia, this is a business associate, Mr. Reynolds. He was just leaving." Reynolds stared at Sophia, his expression a complex mixture of wonder and calculation. The resemblance was undeniable. They shared the same deep-set eyes, the same slight dimple in the left cheek when their expressions turned serious. "Hello, Sophia," Reynolds said, his voice softer now. "It's very nice to meet you." Sophia glanced up at Jackson, clearly sensing the tension in the room. "Hello," she replied politely. Moving closer to Jackson's side, "We'll continue this discussion later," Jackson told Reynolds firmly, guiding Sophia toward the hallway. As Reynolds left, his parting words hung in the air. "Sooner than you think, Blackwell." That night, after Sophia was asleep, Jackson made a difficult decision. He wouldn't wait for Reynolds to dictate the terms of their confrontation. It was time to tell Sophia the truth. About Reynolds, about Whitney, about everything. The following morning, Jackson sat with Sophia at the breakfast table, watching as she methodically arranged her cereal pieces in neat rows. Her small ritual, one of many he'd noticed over their weeks together, spoke of a child who sought control in a world where adults made all the important decisions for her. "Sophia," he began carefully, "I need to talk to you about something important." She looked up, instantly alert to the seriousness in his tone. Fear flickered across her face, the instinctive reaction of a child who had learned that serious adult. Conversations often preceded unwelcome changes. "You're not in trouble," he quickly assured her. "It's about the man you met yesterday, Mr. Reynolds." "Your business friend?" she asked, pushing her cereal bowl aside. Jackson took a deep breath. "He's not exactly a business friend. He's your biological father, Sophia." Silence filled the kitchen as Sophia processed his words. Her eyes widened slightly, but otherwise her expression remained carefully neutral. Another trait he'd come to recognize, her ability to mask emotions when faced with difficult information. "How do you know?" she finally asked, her voice small but steady. "I had tests done," Jackson admitted. "DNA tests. They confirm he's your father." Sophia frowned slightly. "Does he want me to go live with him?" The directness of her question caught Jackson off guard, though it shouldn't have. Sophia had always shown a remarkable ability to cut to the heart of adult matters. "He says he does," Jackson answered honestly. "But what matters more is what you want, and what's best for you." "Do I have to decide right now?" Jackson shook his head quickly. "No, absolutely not. But I wanted you to know the truth because Mr. Reynolds will probably want to meet with you, to get to know you." Sophia considered this, her small fingers tracing patterns on the table. "Did my mom know he was my dad?" "I believe she did," Jackson said gently. "But for reasons I don't fully understand, she chose not to tell him about you." "Maybe she was protecting me," Sophia suggested quietly, echoing what she had once told him about secrets. Maybe she knew he wouldn't be a good dad. Jackson was careful not to let his personal opinion of Reynolds color his response. Maybe, or maybe she thought she was doing what was best for everyone. At the time, Sophia looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. "Would I still get to see you if I had to go with him?" The question pierced Jackson like a physical pain. "I would make absolutely certain of it," he promised. "No matter what happens with Mr. Reynolds, you and I have a connection now. That doesn't just disappear." She nodded slowly, seeming to take comfort in his words. "Can I think about it? About meeting him?" "Of course," Jackson assured her. "There's no rush. We'll figure this out together." Later that day, Jackson met with his legal team, who presented him with several options. None were ideal. As Sophia's biological father, Reynolds had strong legal standing. The temporary guardianship Jackson had established could be challenged, especially given his tenuous connection as the widower of Sophia's mother. "What about shared custody?" Jackson asked. His lead attorney frowned. "Possible but complicated. You have no biological connection to Sophia, and your relationship to her through Whitney is indirect at best. A judge might be sympathetic to your bond with the child, but Reynolds has biology on his side." Jackson's jaw tightened. "Arrange a meeting with Reynolds and his lawyers. Let's see if we can find a solution that puts Sophia's needs first." That evening, as Jackson read Sophia a bedtime story, she interrupted with a question that had clearly been on her mind all day. "I want to meet him," she said suddenly. "Just to see, is that okay?" Jackson carefully closed the book. "If that's what you want, then yes. I'll arrange it." Sophia studied him carefully. "Will you be there too?" "If you want me to be," he promised. She nodded, seemingly satisfied, and Jackson continued reading, even as his mind raced with all the ways this fragile situation could unravel. He had promised Sophia stability, promised she wouldn't be uprooted again. Now he could only hope he could keep that promise despite Ethan Reynolds' determination to claim his newfound daughter. The meeting was arranged for Saturday afternoon at a neutral location, an upscale restaurant with a private dining room. Jackson arrived early with Sophia, who wore one of her new dresses and a solemn expression that broke his heart. This child had faced more uncertainty in her short life than most adults, and now she was preparing to meet a father she never knew existed. "Nervous?" Jackson asked gently as they settled into their seats. Sophia nodded, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of the tablecloth. "What if he doesn't like me?" she whispered. The question caught Jackson off guard. He had been so focused on Reynolds' intentions that he hadn't fully considered Sophia's fears of rejection. "That's not possible," he assured her, placing his hand over her smaller one. "Anyone who gets to know you would be lucky to have you in their life." Before she could respond, the door opened and Ethan Reynolds entered. He was dressed more casually than their previous encounter, in dark slacks and a blue button-down that Jackson suspected had been chosen to appear more approachable. Reynolds' eyes immediately found Sophia, his expression softening in a way Jackson hadn't witnessed before. "Hello, Sophia," Reynolds said, taking the seat across from them. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." Sophia straightened in her chair, her natural poise surfacing even in this difficult moment. "Hello, Mr. Reynolds," she replied politely. "You can call me Ethan if you'd like," he offered with a smile that seemed genuine, if slightly uncertain. Their conversation began awkwardly, with Reynolds asking standard questions about school and interests that Sophia answered with careful brevity. Jackson remained silent, observing the interaction while maintaining a reassuring presence beside Sophia. Gradually, the conversation became more natural. Reynolds, to Jackson's surprise, proved adept at drawing Sophia out, showing genuine interest in her answers and finding commonalities. They shared a love of sci-fi books and a preference for chocolate ice cream. "Your mother and I knew each other a long time ago," Reynolds explained when Sophia finally asked about their connection. "We lost touch before I knew about you." "Why didn't she tell you?" Sophia asked with the direct curiosity of a child. Reynolds glanced at Jackson briefly before answering. "I think she made the decision she thought was best at the time," he said carefully. "Adults sometimes make complicated choices for reasons that make sense to them." It was a diplomatic answer that Jackson hadn't expected, avoiding placing blame while acknowledging the complexity of Whitney's choice. As lunch progressed, Jackson noticed something unexpected. Reynolds was genuinely good with Sophia. Despite his cutthroat business reputation, he showed patience and attentiveness that suggested he might indeed have something valuable to offer Sophia as a father. The realization was uncomfortable. It would be easier if Reynolds were clearly unsuitable, a straightforward villain in this scenario. Instead, Jackson found himself facing a more complicated truth. Ethan Reynolds might actually be capable of being a decent father to Sophia. When dessert arrived, Reynolds excused himself briefly to take a call, giving Jackson a moment alone with Sophia. "What do you think?" he asked her quietly. Sophia considered the question with her typical thoughtfulness. "He's nice," she said finally. "Different than I expected." "Different how?" She shrugged. "He listens, like you do." The comparison simultaneously warmed and worried Jackson. Sophia was forming a positive impression of Reynolds, which was good for her emotionally but complicated the custody situation immensely. When Reynolds returned, he addressed Sophia directly. "I've enjoyed meeting you today," he said, his tone sincere. "I hope we can spend more time together, get to know each other better." Sophia nodded cautiously. "I'd like that." As they prepared to leave, Reynolds pulled Jackson aside while Sophia gathered her things. "We need to talk," Reynolds said, his voice low. "About arrangements going forward." Jackson nodded stiffly. "My lawyers can—" "Not lawyers," Reynolds interrupted. "Just us." He hesitated, "as two people who care about her welfare." The concession surprised Jackson. "Fine, I'll call you." Outside the restaurant, Reynolds knelt to Sophia's level. "It was wonderful meeting you properly," he said. "May I give you something when you are?" She nodded. He pulled a small box from his pocket and handed it to her. Inside was a delicate silver bracelet with a single charm, a small book that opened to reveal tiny pages. "I heard you like stories," Reynolds explained as Sophia examined it with wonder. "Now you can carry one with you always." The thoughtful gift impressed even Jackson, who had expected something more ostentatious from a billionaire trying to win. "Favor?" As they drove home, Sophia was quieter than usual, occasionally glancing at the bracelet on her wrist. "You okay?" Jackson asked, concerned by her silence. "Is it bad if I like him?" she asked suddenly, her voice small. Jackson's hands tightened on the steering wheel as he carefully considered his response. His personal feelings about Reynolds were irrelevant. What mattered was Sophia's emotional well-being. "No," he said. Finally. "It's not bad at all, it's good actually. But I don't want things to change," she admitted. "I like living with you." The simple confession made Jackson's chest tighten with emotion. "I like having you with me too," he said softly. "And no matter what happens, that won't change. We're connected now, Sophia, remember that." That evening, after Sophia had gone to bed, Jackson poured himself a scotch and stood by the window, watching the city lights below. The meeting had forced him to confront an uncomfortable reality. This wasn't a simple battle between right and wrong, between a suitable guardian and an unsuitable one. Both he and Reynolds could offer Sophia valuable things: security, opportunities, affection. His phone buzzed with a message from Reynolds. "We should discuss shared custody arrangements. She needs both of us." Jackson stared at the words for a long moment. The Ethan Reynolds he thought he knew would never have suggested sharing anything, let alone something as significant as parental rights. Perhaps Sophia had affected him as profoundly as she had Jackson. He typed a reply, agreed for Sophia's sake. It wasn't a resolution, but it was a starting point. Two men setting aside their differences and egos for the welfare of a child who deserved better than to be a pawn in their power struggle. The weeks following Sophia's first meeting with Reynolds evolved into a delicate balancing act. Jackson and Reynolds, guided by their respective legal teams, crafted a temporary arrangement that allowed Sophia to maintain her stable routine while gradually spending more time with her biological father. Wednesdays became Reynolds' days, when Ethan would pick Sophia up from school and spend the afternoon with her, returning her to Jackson's penthouse by dinner. Saturdays featured longer visits, sometimes extending into the evening. The arrangement wasn't perfect, but it offered Sophia consistency while allowing her relationship with Reynolds to develop naturally. Today was Saturday, and Jackson found himself alone in his penthouse, struggling with the emptiness. He had grown accustomed to Sophia's presence, her quiet reading in the corner of the living room, her thoughtful questions at dinner, the sound of her footsteps as she explored the space that had become her home. Without her, the penthouse felt hollow, reverting to the sterile showcase it had been before her arrival. His phone buzzed with a text from Reynolds. Taking Sophia to the Natural History Museum. She mentioned you two hadn't been yet. Jackson felt a twinge of something. Not quite jealousy, but a complex emotion he couldn't easily name. He had indeed promised to take Sophia to the museum weeks ago, but work commitments had repeatedly forced postponement. Now Reynolds was stepping in, fulfilling the promise Jackson had made. She'll enjoy that, he texted back, keeping his response neutral despite his conflicted feelings. Later that afternoon, Jackson met with Marcus in his home office. The investigator had continued monitoring Reynolds, though with less intensity, since their tentative truce began. Reynolds seems genuinely invested in the girl, Marcus reported, reviewing his notes. No red flags in his interactions with her. Actually, he's cleared his schedule significantly. Canceled 3 international trips in the past month alone. Jackson nodded, unsurprised. He had observed Reynolds' growing dedication to Sophia firsthand. The man who had stormed into his penthouse, demanding custody, was gradually being replaced by someone more thoughtful, more patient. A transformation Jackson recognized because he had experienced it himself. "What about his business dealings?" Jackson asked. "Any indication he's distracted or making rash decisions?" Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Looking for weaknesses, boss?" Jackson shook his head. "Just trying to understand where his head is at." Actually, he's been unusually careful lately. Pulled out of that aggressive takeover of Novatech that everyone expected him to push through. Word is, he's focusing on stability over expansion. The information gave Jackson pause. Reynolds' business strategy had always been predatory. Identify vulnerable companies, acquire them aggressively, and extract maximum value regardless of human cost. This apparent shift toward caution and sustainability suggested a more profound change than Jackson had anticipated. His contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of Sophia and Reynolds. He heard their voices in the foyer, Sophia's excited chatter about dinosaur fossils and Reynolds' attentive responses. When they entered the living room, Sophia immediately ran to Jackson, her eyes bright with excitement. "Mr. Blackwell, we saw the biggest dinosaur skeleton ever, and they had a space exhibit with meteorites you could touch." Jackson smiled, genuinely pleased by her enthusiasm. "Sounds incredible. Did you take pictures?" Sophia nodded eagerly, pulling out a small camera, a gift from Reynolds, Jackson assumed, and began scrolling through images. Reynolds stood slightly apart, watching their interaction with an expression Jackson couldn't quite read. When Sophia rushed off to put away her things, Reynolds approached Jackson. "She's remarkable," he said quietly. "Remembers everything the guides told us. Asked questions that impressed even the doctoral student leading the tour." Jackson nodded, a sense of pride warming his chest. She's always been like that, observant, curious. An awkward silence fell between them, two men united only by their connection to the child, now humming happily down the hall. Finally, Reynolds cleared his throat. "My lawyers submitted the formal shared custody proposal yesterday," he said. "Did yours review it yet?" "This morning," Jackson confirmed. "The terms seem reasonable, but you have some concerns about the holiday schedule." Reynolds nodded. "We can discuss modifications. The important thing is consistency for Sophia." It was still strange, this civil negotiation with a man Jackson had considered a ruthless adversary. Just months ago, both had set aside their antagonism in favor of Sophia's well-being, a compromise neither would have considered in any other context. "She asked me something today," Reynolds said after another pause. "Something that I thought you should know about." Jackson tensed slightly. "What was it?" "She asked if she could call me Dad." Reynolds' expression was complex. Pride mingled with uncertainty. "I told her I'd be honored, but that we should talk with you first." The revelation hit Jackson harder than he expected. It was inevitable, of course. Reynolds was her biological father, and their relationship was developing naturally. Still, the thought of Sophia calling Reynolds Dad highlighted Jackson's own ambiguous position in her life. What was he to her? Not her father, not merely her guardian. Something in between that lacked a clear definition. That's between you and Sophia, Jackson said finally, his voice carefully neutral. It makes sense that she'd want to call you that. Reynolds studied him for a moment. She also asked what she should call you. Jackson looked up, surprised. What did you tell her? That it was for the two of you to decide, Reynolds replied. But that she's lucky to have two people who care about her so much. It was perhaps the most generous thing Reynolds had ever said to him, an acknowledgement of Jackson's place in Sophia's life that couldn't have been easy for a man accustomed to viewing relationships as exclusive territory. Before Jackson could respond, Sophia returned, breaking the tension between them. Reynolds said his goodbyes, promising to see her on Wednesday, and left with a nod to Jackson. Not quite friendly, but respectful. That night, as Jackson tucked Sophia into bed, she looked up at him with serious eyes. "Can I ask you something?" "Important," she said. Jackson sat on the edge of her bed. "Of course. Is it okay if I call Mr. Reynolds Dad?" she asked, watching his reaction carefully. Jackson maintained a gentle expression despite the pang in his chest. "Of course it is. He is your dad, after all." Sophia nodded, seeming relieved by his answer. "What about you?" she asked after a moment. "What should I call you?" It was the question Jackson had been anticipating since Reynolds mentioned it. What was he to her? Not her father in blood, but something equally important in heart. "What would you like to call me?" he asked, leaving the decision in her hands. Sophia thought for a moment, her brow furrowing in concentration. Finally, she smiled. "Can I call you Jackson? Not Mr. Blackwell anymore, that sounds too far away." The simplicity of her request touched him deeply. Not Dad. That title belonged to Reynolds now, but his first name bridging the formal distance that had existed between them. "I'd like that very much," he told her honestly. Sophia smiled, satisfied with this resolution, and settled back against her pillows. As Jackson turned off her light, leaving only the soft glow of her moon-shaped nightlight, he realized that names and titles mattered less than the bonds they represented. Whatever Sophia called him, he was committed to being a permanent fixture in her life, a promise he intended to keep regardless of legal documents or biological connections. Autumn gave way to winter, bringing with it the holiday season and new complexities to the delicate balance Jackson and Reynolds had established. The shared custody arrangement had been formalized through their attorneys, and while there were occasional tensions, both men remained committed to making it work for Sophia's sake. On this particular evening, Jackson sat in his office reviewing the holiday schedule. Thanksgiving would be spent with Reynolds, Christmas Eve with Jackson, and Christmas Day split between them. It was a reasonable compromise, but Jackson couldn't help feeling a twinge of melancholy. This would be his first Christmas with Sophia, yet he would have to share it. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Sophia stood in the doorway, clutching a folder of school papers. "Are you busy?" she asked, hovering uncertainly at the threshold. Jackson smiled, immediately setting his work aside. "Never too busy for you. What's up?" She entered and placed the folder on his desk. "I have a school project. We have to make a family tree." Jackson felt his chest tighten. Family trees were complicated enough for children with traditional families, but for Sophia, with her unique situation, it presented particular challenges. "Mrs. Bennett said we could define family however we want," Sophia continued, watching his reaction carefully. "It doesn't have to be just blood relatives." Jackson nodded, understanding the unspoken question. "Would you like help with it?" Sophia nodded, pulling out a partially completed chart. She had already placed Whitney at the top, with a line connecting to herself. There were 2 blank spaces on either side of her own name. "I want to put Dad here," she said, pointing to A. 1 blank space. In the months since their first meeting, Dad had become her established name for Reynolds. "But I wasn't sure," she trailed off, looking at the remaining blank space with uncertainty. "Wasn't sure what?" Jackson prompted gently. "If I could put you here," she said quietly, "since we're not related by blood." The simple honesty of her concern touched Jackson deeply. "Family isn't just about blood, Sophia," he said carefully. "It's about who's there for you. Who cares about you? So I can put you on my family tree? If you want to, Jackson assured her. I'd be honored. Sophia smiled, visibly relieved. Mrs. Bennet said we should include important information about each person. What should I write for you? Jackson thought for a moment. Whatever you think is important about me. With serious concentration, Sophia bent over her project, writing carefully next to the space where his name would go. Jackson resisted the urge to peek, giving her privacy to express her thoughts. Later that evening, after Sophia had gone to bed, Jackson found the family tree project on the dining table. Curiosity overcame him, and he gently opened the folder. What he saw made his throat tighten with emotion. In neat handwriting beside Whitney's name, Sophia had written, "My mom. She loved books and the ocean. She had a beautiful smile." Next to Reynolds' name, "My dad. He's smart and tells funny jokes. He teaches me about science." And beside Jackson's name, she had written, "He saved me. He keeps his promises. He makes me feel safe." The simple assessment, so honest, so perceptive, affected Jackson more deeply than elaborate praise ever could. In Sophia's eyes, his most important quality wasn't his wealth or achievements, but his reliability. He had promised her stability, and that promise meant everything to her. The following day, Jackson received an unexpected call from Reynolds. "I need a favor," Reynolds said, foregoing any greeting. "I have an emergency board meeting that can't be rescheduled. It's Wednesday, my day with Sophia. Could you keep her?" "Of course," Jackson replied, surprised by the request. Reynolds had never missed his designated time with Sophia before. "Thanks," Reynolds said, sounding genuinely relieved. "And there's something else. Sophia's birthday is coming up next month, January 14th, Jackson confirmed. "I've already started planning something small." "I was thinking we could do something together," Reynolds suggested. "A joint celebration. For her sake." The proposal caught Jackson off guard. Their carefully negotiated arrangement had maintained clear boundaries between their respective times with Sophia. A joint celebration would be unprecedented and complicated. "You think that's a good idea?" Jackson asked cautiously. "I think it's what Sophia would want," Reynolds replied simply. "She shouldn't have to divide her special day between us." Jackson couldn't argue with that logic. "All right, we'll plan something together." After ending the call, Jackson found himself reflecting on how much had changed. Months ago, the thought of collaborating with Ethan Reynolds on anything, let alone a child's birthday party, would have seemed absurd. Yet here they were, two former adversaries finding common ground for the sake of a little girl who had unexpectedly become the center of both their lives. That evening, as Jackson helped Sophia with her homework, she looked up suddenly. "Dad told me he can't come tomorrow," she said. "He said there was an important meeting." Jackson nodded. "That's right. You'll stay here with me instead." Sophia seemed to consider this carefully. "He looked sad about it. I told him it was okay." "That was kind of you," Jackson said, touched by her empathy. "I think he worries I'll be upset with him if he misses things," she observed with surprising insight. "Like I might think he doesn't care enough." Jackson marveled at her perceptiveness. "Adults worry about that sometimes. But I know he cares," Sophia said simply. "And I know you do too. That's what matters." In that moment, Jackson realized that Sophia understood something that he and Reynolds were still learning. That caring wasn't measured in perfect attendance or expensive gifts, but in consistent presence and genuine effort. She had accepted their imperfect arrangement with a grace that humbled him. As winter deepened and Sophia's birthday approached, Jackson found himself adjusting to this new reality, one where he and Reynolds weren't enemies fighting for possession, but partners, in the more complex task of raising a child who needed them both. It wasn't the family he had ever imagined having, but as Sophia's project had reminded him, family wasn't defined by conventional boundaries. It was defined by love, commitment, and the promises kept along the way. Sophia's 9th birthday arrived on a clear, crisp January day. After weeks of careful negotiation and planning, Jackson and Reynolds had agreed to host a combined celebration at a charming indoor garden venue in Brooklyn, neutral territory that would comfortably accommodate the unusual gathering of two billionaire rivals and a handful of Sophia's classmates from Brighton Academy. Jackson arrived early to oversee the final arrangements. The space had been transformed with twinkling lights and colorful decorations featuring Sophia's favorite books and characters. A table of carefully wrapped presents stood in one corner, while caterers prepared an elaborate spread designed to appeal to both children and adults. "Everything looks perfect," Rebecca commented, arriving to help with last-minute details. She had become an unexpected ally in Jackson's journey with Sophia, offering practical assistance and occasional guidance when he found himself out of his depth on child-related matters. "I hope so," Jackson replied, adjusting a slightly crooked banner. Sophia deserves a special day. Reynolds arrived next, carrying an enormous gift box that required the assistance of his driver. His eyes swept the decorated space approvingly before meeting Jackson's gaze. "Well done, Blackwell," he acknowledged with a slight nod. "It was a joint effort," Jackson reminded him, determined to maintain the spirit of cooperation they had established. Before any tension could develop, Sophia arrived with Clara from Harmony House, who had been specially invited for the occasion. Sophia's face lit up as she took in the decorated space and the two men waiting for her. "This is amazing," she exclaimed, her eyes wide with wonder. What followed was perhaps the most unusual social event either man had ever hosted. A children's birthday party featuring two CEOs who typically met only in boardrooms or through competing press releases. Yet for Sophia's sake, they set aside their natural rivalry, engaging with her friends and their parents with surprising grace. Jackson observed Reynolds throughout the afternoon, noting how he had abandoned his usual intimidating demeanor in favor of a more approachable presence. He joined the children's games without self-consciousness, seeming genuinely pleased by Sophia's delight at each activity. When it came time for cake, Reynolds caught Jackson's eye and nodded slightly toward the kitchen. Understanding the silent request, Jackson followed him to a quieter space away from the festivities. "I have something to discuss with you," Reynolds said, his expression serious. "About Sophia's future." Jackson tensed immediately. "What about it?" "I'm planning to relocate my company's headquarters," Reynolds explained, "to London." The statement hit Jackson like a physical blow. Their carefully constructed arrangement depended on proximity. If Reynolds moved to London, the delicate balance they had established would collapse entirely. "And you want to take Sophia with you," Jackson concluded, his voice tight. Reynolds shook his head. "That's just it. I don't." Jackson blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected response. "At least not permanently," Reynolds clarified. "I've been watching her these past months. She's thriving, Blackwell. Her teachers say she's excelling academically. She's making friends. She's happy." He paused, seeming to struggle with his next words. "Uprooting her now would undo all that stability. I won't do that to her." Jackson studied the man carefully, searching for some hidden motive behind this apparent selflessness. "What are you suggesting?" "I'll maintain my current visitation schedule through video calls when I'm away, and in person during the months I'm back in New York," Reynolds explained. "The company transition will take about 2 years, during which I'll split my time between locations. Once things are settled, we can reassess." The proposal was unexpectedly reasonable, prioritizing Sophia's well-being over Reynolds' parental rights. It was a sacrifice Jackson hadn't anticipated from a man known for his ruthless pursuit of personal interests. "Why are you doing this?" Jackson asked bluntly. Reynolds was quiet for a moment, his gaze drifting toward the party room where Sophia's laughter could be heard. "When I first found out about her, all I could think about was what I was owed," he admitted. "My right to know my child, my right to be her father, but now what? Now I understand what Whitney might have seen in me all those years ago," Reynolds said quietly. Someone too consumed with ambition to put a child's needs first. The raw honesty of the statement hung between them. Two driven men who had been forced to reconsider their priorities because of one small girl. She needs consistency, Reynolds continued. She needs the life you've given her. I won't take that away just to satisfy my ego. Jackson found himself genuinely moved by Reynolds' evolution. She needs you too, he acknowledged. You're her father. We'll make this work, for her sake. When they returned to the party, Sophia was waiting to open her presents, her face alight with anticipation. As Jackson watched her carefully unwrap each gift, exclaiming with genuine gratitude regardless of size or cost, he felt a surge of protective affection that had only grown stronger over the months. Later, as the party wound down and guests began to leave, Clara approached Jackson with a small envelope. Whitney left this for Sophia, she explained. To be given on her 9th birthday. I thought today would be the right time. Jackson accepted the envelope with surprise. You've had this all along? Clara nodded. Whitney was very specific about the timing. When only Jackson, Reynolds, and Sophia remained, Jackson presented her with the envelope. There's one more gift, he said gently. From your mother. Sophia's eyes widened as she took the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was a handwritten letter and a small silver key. She read silently, tears gathering in her eyes as she reached the end. What does it say? Reynolds asked softly. She wrote it before she died, Sophia explained, her voice wavering. She says she loves me and that she hopes I'll understand someday why she made the choices she did. The key is for a special box she left with Miss Clara that has things from when I was a baby. The three of them sat together in silence. The weight of Whitney's presence felt strongly in the room. She had connected them in ways none could have predicted, her choices, however complicated, ultimately bringing them to this moment. As they prepared to leave, Sophia suddenly embraced both men, one arm around each of them, pulling them into an unexpected group hug. This was the best birthday ever, she declared with conviction. Looking over her head, Jackson and Reynolds shared a brief glance of mutual understanding. Their unusual arrangement wasn't perfect, but for Sophia, they would continue to make it work. Two men who had learned, somewhat reluctantly, to share the most important responsibility either had ever faced. Spring arrived in New York with its characteristic unpredictability. Warm, sunny days interspersed with sudden downpours that left the city streets glistening. The seasonal transition mirrored the evolving dynamics among Jackson, Reynolds, and Sophia as they adjusted to their new arrangement. Reynolds had begun his transatlantic business restructuring, spending 2 weeks in London followed by 2 weeks in New York. During his absences, nightly video calls with Sophia became a ritual, with Jackson ensuring she had the privacy and technical support needed for these virtual visits with her father. On this particular morning, Jackson sat in the kitchen reviewing emails while Sophia prepared for school. Their routine had become comfortable and familiar. Breakfast together, followed by the short drive to Brighton Academy, where Jackson would drop her off before heading to his office. Jackson? Sophia asked, spreading jam on her toast with careful concentration. Can I ask you something? Always, he replied, setting his tablet aside to give her his full attention. Dad said he's taking me to London this summer for 2 weeks, she said. Is that okay? The question caught Jackson slightly off guard. Reynolds had mentioned the possibility during their last conversation, but no firm plans had been discussed. If that's something you want to do, then yes, he said carefully. It would be a great experience for you. Sophia studied his face with her characteristic perceptiveness. Would you miss me? The simple question touched him deeply. Very much, he admitted. But that shouldn't stop you from going. That's what happens when you care about someone. You want what's best for them, even if it means being apart sometimes. She seemed to consider this thoughtfully. Dad said you could come too if you wanted. Now Jackson was genuinely surprised. Reynolds inviting him to join their London trip was unexpected, to say the least. He did, Sophia nodded. He said it might be nice for all of us to see London together, like a family trip. The concept of a family trip with Reynolds was so foreign that Jackson momentarily struggled to respond. Their carefully negotiated custody arrangement had always maintained clear boundaries and separate time with Sophia. This suggestion represented a significant shift. "I'll talk to your dad about it," he promised, not wanting to commit until he understood Reynolds's intentions better. Later that day, Jackson called Reynolds, who was currently in London. "Sophia mentioned a summer trip," Jackson said after brief pleasantries, "and that you suggested I join you both." There was a slight pause before Reynolds responded. "I did," he confirmed. "It makes practical sense. She's never traveled internationally before, and having both of us there would make the transition easier for her." "That's unexpectedly considerate," Jackson noted, unable to keep a hint of suspicion from his voice. Reynolds sighed audibly. "Look, Blackwell, we're past the point of scoring points against each other. The past 9 months have made one thing clear. Sophia functions best when her life isn't divided into separate compartments. When we cooperate, she thrives." The assessment was accurate, if surprising coming from Reynolds. There had been a noticeable, positive change in Sophia's confidence and emotional security as the tensions between the two men decreased. Besides, Reynolds continued with unexpected candor, "She talks about you constantly when she's with me. And I suspect she talks about me when she's with you. It's become obvious that forcing her to maintain separate relationships with us creates an unnecessary burden." Jackson couldn't argue with that observation. Sophia was indeed careful to share stories about her time with Reynolds, clearly trying to integrate both men into her concept of family. "I'll consider it," Jackson said finally. 2 days later, Clara called with news that would again shift the dynamics among them. Whitney's personal storage unit, which had remained untouched since her death, needed to be cleared out as the facility was changing ownership. Among the items discovered was a sealed box marked, "For Sophia, personal." "I think you and Mr. Reynolds should both be present when she opens it," Clara suggested. "There might be information that affects all of you." That weekend, they gathered in Jackson's penthouse. Sophia, Jackson, Reynolds, back from London temporarily, and Clara. The box sat on the coffee table, its presence commanding attention, like a silent fourth participant in their unusual family configuration. "This belonged to your mother," Clara explained gently to Sophia. "I believe it contains things she wanted you to have someday." With the small silver key from her birthday letter, Sophia carefully unlocked the box. Inside were several items: a journal bound in soft leather, photographs, a few pieces of jewelry, and a sealed envelope addressed to Sophia, Ethan, and Jackson. Reynolds and Jackson exchanged surprised glances at the sight of their names written in Whitney's handwriting, especially Jackson's, as Whitney had passed away years before Sophia entered his life. "She knew," Clara said quietly, noting their confusion. "Whitney always believed that someday, somehow, you would both be part of Sophia's life. She prepared for that possibility." Sophia handed the envelope to Jackson with solemn reverence. "Will you read it?" With steady hands, Jackson opened the envelope and began reading Whitney's letter aloud. "My dearest Sophia, and to Ethan and Jackson, if you're reading this together, as I hope you might be someday, I'm writing this during the final months of my illness, when the doctors have made it clear my time is limited. There are truths I need to share, and choices I need to explain. Sophia, my beautiful daughter, I've made decisions that may seem confusing or hurtful, but please know they were made with love. Placing you at Harmony House was the most difficult choice I ever faced, but I believed it offered you protection during a tumultuous time in my life. Ethan, you deserve to know about our daughter. My failure to tell you was born not from malice, but from fear. Fear that our brief relationship couldn't sustain the weight of parenthood. Fear that your ambitions and mine were too consuming to nurture a child properly. I was wrong to make that decision alone, and for that I am truly sorry. Jackson, my love, if you're reading this, it means Sophia has found her way to you, as I always believed she might. You brought stability and purpose to my life when I needed most. I kept Sophia separate from our life together not because I didn't trust you, but because I feared disrupting the happiness we had found. It was cowardly, and I regret not having the courage to unite all parts of my life. My greatest hope is that somehow, the three people I loved most in this world have found a way to form a family. Unconventional, perhaps, but bound by their shared care for one another. Sophia deserves nothing less than to be surrounded by people who put her needs above their own ambitions and differences. With eternal love, Whitney. When Jackson finished reading, silence filled the room, each person absorbing Whitney's words in their own way. Sophia's eyes shimmered with tears, but her expression held wonder rather than grief, as if she had received a precious gift in her mother's final thoughts. Reynolds sat motionless, his usual confident demeanor replaced by genuine emotion. "She knew," he said finally, his voice rough. "Somehow she knew we'd end up here." Jackson carefully refolded the letter, touched beyond words by Whitney's faith in him, in all of them, to eventually find their way to this unlikely alliance. Clara, who had been quietly observing, smiled gently. "Whitney was always remarkable at seeing the best in people," she said, "even when they couldn't see it in themselves." The London trip that summer became a turning point for their unusual family arrangement. For 2 weeks, Jackson, Reynolds, and Sophia navigated the historic city together, creating memories that none had anticipated when their paths first crossed at Whitney's grave. Reynolds had arranged a spacious townhouse in Kensington, where Sophia had her own room, while Jackson and Reynolds maintained separate spaces and respectful boundaries. The physical proximity forced a level of cooperation and communication they had previously avoided, each man making concessions for Sophia's benefit. On their 3rd day in London, they visited the British Museum, where Sophia's enthusiasm for history and artifacts impressed both men. As she raced ahead to examine a display of ancient Egyptian jewelry, Reynolds fell into step beside Jackson. "I keep thinking about Whitney's letter," he said quietly. "About her hoping we'd find a way to make this work," Jackson nodded. The letter had affected him deeply as well, Whitney's posthumous faith in them serving as both comfort and challenge. "She saw something in both of us that we didn't see ourselves," Jackson acknowledged. Reynolds smiled slightly. "The capacity to put aside our egos for someone else's welfare? That's not typically a quality associated with men like us." It was perhaps the most self-aware statement Jackson had ever heard from Reynolds, an acknowledgement of the transformation they had both undergone since Sophia entered their lives. "Men like us change," Jackson said simply, "when the stakes are high enough." Their conversation was interrupted by Sophia calling them over to see a particularly interesting exhibit. As they joined her, museum docent smiled at the three of them. "Your daughter has quite the eye for historical details," she commented. "She's noticed elements in these artifacts that most adults miss." Neither man corrected her assumption that they were a couple with their daughter. The explanation was too complex for a casual interaction, and something about the simplicity of her perception felt oddly fitting in that moment. The remainder of their London stay unfolded with surprising harmony. There were occasional disagreements about scheduling or activities, but they were resolved with a newfound maturity, both men recognizing that their example of conflict resolution was as important to Sophia's development as any educational experience they could provide. On their final evening in London, after Sophia had gone to bed, Jackson and Reynolds sat in the townhouse's small garden, sharing a rare moment of relaxed conversation over glasses of scotch. "I'm expanding operations on the West Coast," Jackson mentioned casually. "San Francisco office needs attention for the next quarter." Reynolds nodded, understanding the implication. "I'll be primarily in New York until October. I can cover more time with Sophia while you're away." This easy exchange of practical information would have been unthinkable months earlier, when every interaction was laden with suspicion and territorial concerns. Now, it felt almost natural, two co-parents coordinating schedules for their child's benefit. "She's happy," Reynolds observed, looking toward the window of Sophia's room. "Genuinely happy. Not just coping or surviving, but thriving." "That's all Whitney wanted," Jackson replied. "All any of us want for her." Reynolds swirled the amber liquid in his glass thoughtfully. I've been thinking about the coming school year. Brighton is excellent, but with both our travel schedules increasing, the daily logistics are becoming complicated. Jackson had been considering the same issue. What did you have in mind? Westlake Academy has an exceptional boarding program with weekends home, Reynolds suggested. Many of my colleagues' children attend. The educational standards are impeccable, and it would provide consistency during our busier periods. A year ago, Jackson would have immediately rejected any suggestion from Reynolds as an attempt to control Sophia's future. Now he considered it objectively, weighing the benefits for her. We should visit the campus before making any decisions, he said, and Sophia would need to be fully on board. No pressuring her one way or the other. Reynolds agreed readily. Of course, it's just an option to consider. As they continued discussing practical matters related to Sophia's future, Jackson reflected on the strange path that had led them here. Two career-driven men, once rivals, now sitting in a London garden discussing school options like any other, parents concerned about their child's education. When they returned to New York, the transition was smoother than anticipated. Sophia returned to her routine with a new confidence, speaking excitedly to her friends about her international adventure. Both men resumed their demanding work schedules, but with a more coordinated approach to ensuring Sophia's needs remained prioritized. The visit to Westlake Academy proved illuminating. The campus was indeed impressive, with extensive academic and extracurricular offerings. Sophia approached the tour with characteristic thoughtfulness, asking detailed questions about the library, science facilities, and weekend arrangements. "What do you think?" Jackson asked her afterward as they drove back to the city. "Remember, this is completely your decision. No pressure either way." Sophia was quiet for a moment, considering. "I think I'd like to stay at Brighton," she finally said. "At least for now. I have friends there, and I like coming home every day." Her reference to home, Jackson's penthouse, warmed him unexpectedly. After nearly a year in his care, Sophia had finally begun using that word without hesitation. Brighton. "'Tis," Reynolds agreed from the back seat. "We'll make the current arrangement work." That evening, as Jackson helped Sophia organize her school supplies for the upcoming term, she looked up with a serious expression. "Can I ask you something important?" "Of course," Jackson replied, setting down the stack of notebooks he'd been labeling. "Are you and Dad friends now?" she asked, her tone suggesting the answer mattered deeply to her. Jackson considered the question carefully. "I don't know if friends is exactly the right word," he answered honestly. "But we respect each other, and we both want what's best for you. That's what matters most." Sophia nodded, seemingly satisfied. "Mom would be happy about that," she said with certainty. "That we're all taking care of each other." The simple observation struck Jackson with unexpected force. Perhaps that was exactly what they had become. Three people taking care of each other in their own ways, forming a family unlike any he had ever imagined, but no less real for its unconventional structure. As the new school year began and autumn approached, their arrangement continued to evolve and strengthen. The custody schedule remained flexible, adapting to both men's business demands while maintaining Sophia's sense of security. There were challenges, of course, miscommunications, occasional tensions, but the foundation they had built proved resilient. Whitney's vision, so clearly articulated in her letter, was gradually becoming reality, a family formed not by traditional bonds, but by the shared commitment to a child who had brought unexpected purpose and meaning to all their lives. 2 years later, on a warm June afternoon, Sophia stood on the stage of Brighton Academy's auditorium, accepting the Outstanding Achievement in Science Award at her 5th grade graduation ceremony. From the audience, Jackson and Reynolds watched with identical expressions of pride, seated side by side in the front row. "She's remarkable," Reynolds whispered as Sophia delivered a poised thank you speech. Jackson nodded in agreement, just like her mother. The past 2 years had transformed all their lives in ways none could have predicted. Reynolds had successfully established his London operations while maintaining his New York presence, ensuring he never spent more than 3 weeks away from Sophia. Jackson had expanded Blackwell Industries across 3 continents, but arranged his travel schedule to complement Reynolds, creating a seamless support system for Sophia. More surprisingly, the 2 men had developed a relationship that, while not exactly friendship, had evolved into a genuine partnership based on mutual respect and shared purpose. Their initial animosity had given way to an understanding that transcended their business rivalry. After the ceremony, the 3 of them celebrated at Sophia's favorite restaurant, joined by Clara from Harmony House, who had remained a treasured connection to Whitney. As Sophia chatted excitedly about her upcoming science camp, Jackson noticed how confident and secure she had become, a far cry from the guarded, uncertain child he had met at the cemetery 3 years ago. "I have something for both of you," Sophia announced suddenly, pulling 2 small gift boxes from her backpack. "For graduation. We're supposed to be giving you gifts, not the other way around," Reynolds said with a smile, accepting the carefully wrapped package. "These are special," Sophia insisted, watching expectantly as they opened their presents. Inside each box was an identical silver compass, elegantly engraved. Jackson examined his closely, reading the inscription on the back. "To guide you home. Love, Sophia." The sentiment caught in his throat, rendering him momentarily speechless. "I picked compasses because you both travel so much," Sophia explained. "But you always find your way back to me." Reynolds appeared equally moved, turning the compass over in his hands. "It's perfect," he said, his voice uncharacteristically soft. "Thank you." Later that evening, after Reynolds had departed for a late business meeting and Sophia had gone to bed, Jackson sat in his living room reflecting on the journey that had brought them here. His phone buzzed with a message from Marcus, who had long since shifted from investigating Reynolds to occasionally joining them for informal dinners. "Heads up. Vanessa Powell mentioned board position opening at Brighton Academy. Thought you might be interested. Reynolds already accepted one." Jackson smiled at the information. Of course, Reynolds had secured a position on the school board. His competitive nature hadn't entirely disappeared, but now their rivalry had been redirected toward positive channels, each man striving to contribute to Sophia's world in meaningful ways. He walked down the hall to Sophia's room, quietly opening the door to check on her. She was sleeping peacefully, surrounded by books and science awards, the moonlight from her window illuminating the framed family photo on her nightstand. A candid shot from their London trip showing, the 3 of them laughing together at a street performance. Beside it stood a portrait of Whitney, her smile radiant and knowing, as if she had somehow foreseen that her greatest legacy would be this unlikely family she had connected through her love. The following morning, Sophia joined Jackson for breakfast, already dressed for her Saturday visit with Reynolds. "Jackson?" she asked, carefully spreading jam on her toast, just as she had done countless mornings over the years. "Can I ask you something important?" To her familiar phrase, her way of signaling a significant conversation, made him set aside his coffee. "Always." "I've been thinking about names," she said, her expression thoughtful. "About what I call you and Dad." Jackson nodded, encouraging her to continue. "I call him Dad because that's who he is biologically," she explained with characteristic precision. "But you're just as much my parent as he is, just in a different way." The statement warmed Jackson deeply, though he wasn't sure where she was heading with this line of thought. "I was wondering if..." She hesitated, suddenly uncertain. "If I could call you Papa. Not all the time maybe, but sometimes when it feels right." The request caught Jackson completely off guard. In all their years together, despite the deepening of their bond, he had carefully maintained the distinction between himself and Reynolds, never attempting to claim the title of father in any form. "You don't have to answer right away," Sophia added quickly, misinterpreting his silence. "It was just an idea." Jackson reached across the table and took her hand. "I would be honored," he said simply, his voice thick with emotion. "More than you could ever know." Sophia's face brightened with relief and happiness. "Really?" "Really," he confirmed, "But what does your dad think about this?" "I already asked him," she replied with a small smile. "He said it was about time I made it official." The revelation that Reynolds had approved, had even encouraged this development, spoke volumes about how far they had all come. What had begun as a bitter custody battle had transformed into a genuine family, unconventional in its structure, but unquestionable in its commitment. When Reynolds arrived to pick up Sophia an hour later, he greeted Jackson with their now customary nod of respect. "She told you?" he asked quietly as Sophia gathered her things. Jackson nodded. "Thank you for that." Reynolds shrugged slightly. "It's what Whitney would have wanted. For Sophia to have both of us, fully and without reservation." As they prepared to leave, Sophia hugged Jackson tightly. "See you tomorrow, Papa," she said, testing the new name with a mixture of shyness and certainty. "See you tomorrow," Jackson replied, the unfamiliar title settling around his heart like a missing piece finally found. Standing at the window, watching, as Reynolds and Sophia entered the elevator, Jackson reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun that autumn day at Whitney's grave. He had walked into the cemetery a lonely widower, bound by grief and isolation, and had walked out with a connection that would ultimately heal and transform him. Whitney had given him one final, extraordinary gift. Not just a child to care for, but a family to belong to. In her wisdom or intuition, she had somehow known that Sophia would bring together the two men who had loved her, creating from that unlikely foundation a home where her daughter could thrive. Jackson touched the silver, compass in his pocket, tracing the engraved words with his finger. "To guide you home." Sophia had given him more than a sentimental gift. She had given him a purpose, a direction, a place to belong. For a man who had once measured success in acquisitions and market shares, Jackson now understood a more profound truth. Family wasn't defined by blood or legal documents, but by the promises kept, the sacrifices made, and the love given freely without expectation of return. In the end, Whitney had been right. They had found their way to becoming a family. Unconventional, imperfect, but unquestionably real.